Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, June 5th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election and where President Biden can make improvements on my most recent projection from June 1st, which puts him at a spot and a chance of victory with 271 electoral votes to President Trump's 267. Now, this video has been inspired by comments that have been genuinely speculating. Where does President Biden have an opportunity to expand not only from this map, but from his 2020 presidential electoral map? Now, to give you a bit of a flashback to what that looked like just 4 years ago, President Biden won the election with 306 electoral votes to 232 for President Trump. Joe Biden was able to flip the red states from 2016 of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. 5 states moved over to the Democratic Party side here that ultimately put Joe Biden ahead. This was in conjunction with a popular vote victory and Democrats winning Senate control alongside House control in what was the first Democratic trifecta since President Obama's first term. Now, the 2020 presidential election did not leave much room for improvement for President Biden in a future presidential election. Just 2 states won by the Republican Party were won by less than 1 percentage point, by less than 5 percentage points rather, which was North Carolina and Florida. Beyond that, every Republican state had pretty much been pretty solid for the Republican Party, with very limited exceptions. For instance, when you take a look at the next closest state across the map, you're talking about states like Texas, which we know that Democrats more than likely are not going to win here, but the fact is, outside of Florida and North Carolina, Texas is the next barrier of entry for Democrats to really expand the electoral map into that much more for their electoral college victory. And I think that really serves to show exactly how limited this electoral map is for 2024, how limited President Biden is, but also explains why President Biden has multiple pathways to victory. You could peel away major states from the Biden column in 2020. For instance, states like Pennsylvania you could take away. That would bring down the Biden map to 286 electoral votes. Take away Michigan on top of that, you're down to 270. And so it's a very interesting map here that President Biden does in fact have a bit of wiggle room that should be recognized and should be acknowledged, especially when we're talking about where expansion can happen, not necessarily just playing defense, but also just generally for this election, why President Biden still very much has a chance at victory, even if the polls seem to suggest that he doesn't. These polls are unlike any of the ones that we've seen in the past decade, honestly. Even Mitt Romney was never polling this high when it came down to head-to-head matchups against President Obama. Never did Donald Trump lead Secretary Clinton or President Biden this way in either of the 2016 or 2020 elections. And so for 2024 to come around with Donald Trump ahead by this much, it comes into a point of questioning, does this mean Biden has no mathematical pathway to victory? And obviously, that is not how I feel about this race. Here's where my map is, 271 to 267, but I do believe there actually is an opportunity for President Biden to, again, not only win, but expand based on 2020. And so it's going to take a lot, and it certainly will require some adjusting of the margins here. The good news is, I'll keep this map up for you. We can go ahead and use it as a point of comparison between the new adjusted map and the old map to really see where President Biden needs to make significant improvements upon if he wants to actually expand on his electoral map. And the reason why that matters is because no president has been reelected, with the exception of President Woodrow Wilson and President Obama, by winning less electoral votes the second time around. It is very, very rare that that happens. The majority of incumbents that choose to run for reelection also win reelection to the presidency. And so for President Biden to be the third in line there actually does go a bit against history. And so you would actually want to see what is the mathematical pathway to President Biden expanding his electoral map. And so at 271 at a baseline, again, adjusting the margins in some other battleground states will also require the already characterized ones that might not be moving over to Biden and might already be in Biden's column to adjust as well in order to reflect what this might look like on a grand national level. Okay, here we are, 2024 electoral map. Let's start off with the basics. At baseline for President Biden to do better across the map, he first needs to really solidify his bases, shore them up. States like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona can't be as competitive as they are right now. And that namely speaks to states like Arizona and Michigan, where we need to see a level of performance similar to what we saw the Democrats in the 2022 midterms. Not saying Biden needs a Gretchen Whitmer 11-point victory in Michigan, but he certainly needs to be doing better than he did in 2020, which was a 3-point margin of victory. Reasonably speaking, Michigan, if we're talking about expansion of an electoral map, needs to not only be lean, or tilt even, but likely blue, meaning it's above 5 points in favor of the Democratic Party. With that being said, in the state of Arizona, what we have seen here consistently from 2018 actually, well, really 2016, is significant improvements for Democrats election after election after election after election. 4 consecutive elections. 16, then 18 flipped blue, 2020 flipped blue in the presidential, 22 the governorship flipped blue. So then 2024 cannot be exactly how it was in 2020. Cannot be a Biden plus 0.3% victory. It needs to be a strong electoral victory for the Democratic Party, meaning it's a lean state. Not tilt, not waiting till Maricopa County comes in with the finalization of ballots here. It needs to be, in totality, a Biden at least 2 to 5 point state, which means Arizona shifts over to the Democratic Party side. Now, with this, though, we really don't need to touch any of the other states that have already been characterized in favor of Joe Biden. We don't need to touch Maine at large, or Minnesota, or Virginia, or Colorado, or New Mexico, or New Hampshire even, or Nebraska 2nd District, and even Pennsylvania. Even though I did group it in first, I want to first say, I was expecting President Biden to win the state by roughly 1 point, 2 points in this re-election bid as of today. I think in a scenario like this one, it needs to be closer to 4 to 5 points, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it would be likely blue. I don't think it deserves the same characterization as Michigan. Even right now, I think Michigan is closer today, but if we're talking about a scenario in which Biden is expanding the electoral map, Pennsylvania I still think can stay as a lean Democratic state. And so there, 271 for Joe Biden, but that doesn't mean he's not going to have any other states moving over into his column, because again, this is all about expansion of an electoral map. He would need to first start off by winning back Nevada, a state that Democrats have had very strong performances in since 2004, the last time they lost it on the presidential level, and Joe Biden would need to win the state. And he would need to win the state by roughly the same margin that he did in 2020, if not better. I think Nevada, though, we have seen a pretty consistent move away from the Democratic Party. Marginal, but over time does add up. And so Nevada right now, I would say Donald Trump does have the upper hand. I think he would win the state if the election was held today, but Joe Biden would need to win it if we're talking about a scenario like this one. Does it need to be 4 to 5 points? No. It should probably be anywhere from 2.5 to 3. For context, Biden won the state by 2.4 in 2020, and Hillary Clinton did as well in 2016. And so by preventing that bleeding, even a 2.5% performance there would show that while the rest of the country, in some cases, might be moving right, and while Nevada, honestly, has the demographic shifts and the overall sentiment changes amongst minority voters to be shifting right, if that is not only counteracted, but reversed, meaning that you see Biden doing better than he did in 2020, that's a very strong sign that 2024 is going to get better for Biden than it was in 2020. And so Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan really start to bring this in. We would next move over to the state of Wisconsin, where President Biden would need to win the state by a lean margin, not tilt like it was in 2020. He won it by 0.6 in 2020. Trump won the state in 2016 by 0.7. And so Wisconsin would need to take a step back from being this ever-competitive, state here and become a Biden plus 2 to 3 point state. Less than Pennsylvania and certainly less than Michigan, but still a Democratic state and still by more than a point. It needs to be less competitive than it is right now because this state is largely seen as one that will be a true litmus test of President Biden's performance in his re-election bid. We could very well see President Biden, lose the election through a state like Wisconsin, and it could tell us a bigger story about where the rest of the country is and where the Rust Belt is and where some of these more competitive states are. And so if Biden is winning it by, 2 to 3 points, an expansion of 2020, 2016, not as good as Obama 2008 or 2012. He had a, really strong grip on the voters there. But stronger than John Kerry, stronger than Al Gore. I mean, he would be the second best performing Democrat in this state in the 21st century, and that would mean something. And so Wisconsin would move over to the Democratic Party side. Joe Biden would bump up to 287 electoral votes, which means the pathways moving forward would really rely on Georgia, North Carolina, and honestly speaking, there isn't much else there for national Democrats. But let's go ahead and get into it. So Georgia, in this case, I think very similar to Arizona, would need to move outside of the tilt Democratic column. I don't see a reality in which Biden is able to expand on his electoral numbers, beyond Georgia, unless he wins it by a larger margin than he did in 2020. And there isn't much room for error there for Democrats. It was a 0.22%, 23%, something around there, result, margin of victory for Joe Biden in 2020. And here's the thing. The national electoral map, even if Biden wins his 2020 states, actually ends up performing worse than he did in 2020 because the Electoral College took a vote from Michigan, took a vote from Pennsylvania, took a vote from some Democratic states like California, took a vote from New York here. What you found was that overall, there was a net loss for Democrats on the Electoral College map. Yes, they made up for it in Colorado, but then Illinois lost one, and so now you're about even. Overall here, our electoral map has seen a net 3 decrease in Electoral College vote for Joe Biden, even if he wins the same exact states, the same exact districts. This electoral map is not conducive to an expansion or even a matching of the Electoral College in 2020, which means Biden needs to win elsewhere. And elsewhere comes here. North Carolina would have to become the next state to flip blue. I genuinely believe it when I say it. North Carolina will have to flip before Iowa, before Ohio, before Florida, 3 states that went to President Obama in the 2012 presidential election when North Carolina went to Mitt Romney by roughly 2 points. When you look back at 2008 too, to give you context as to how difficult a North Carolina lift is, honestly speaking, for Democrats, North Carolina was a closer state for Obama, a smaller margin of victory than Obama winning in Indiana, a state that in 2020 went to Trump by 16 points. In 2008, Indiana voted to the left of North Carolina. Iowa did too. Ohio did too. Florida did too. And pretty notably, might I add, what we found here was that the Democratic performance across the country was largely extremely strong. And North Carolina was the closest Democratic state across the country. And so for that to have been true, it means every state in this 365 mammoth performance for President Obama, mammoth performance, would have to vote to the left of North Carolina. And that actually isn't that unlikely and is exactly what would have to happen again in 2024. So here's where we're at in comparing electoral maps. The map as I predicted today and the map with a scenario like this one. Now, I will have to acknowledge that in order for a map like this one to happen, we would have to see a reduction in Republican support in some of these already allocated states. States like Texas would have to narrow up anywhere from 4 to 5 points, brings it down to being lean, but again, not competitive enough to be tilt, and certainly not competitive enough to be a Democratic state. It also would mean that we would have to bring back in some of those closer states from 2020. Not as close as, close might think of, but states like South Carolina, which Trump won by 11.7, or Alaska, which Trump won by 10, or Kansas, which Trump won by 14.6, or Nebraska's first, which Trump won by 14.9. Mississippi might move there. Missouri might move there. What I mean here is that you would have to find that some of these more, Republican states would actually have to narrow up in a scenario like this one, because what it means is that there is a shift nationally that would allow Biden to win in a state like North Carolina. And so that would mean South Carolina would have to narrow down. Kansas would have to narrow down. Alaska would have to narrow down. And given an expansion on the electoral map like this one, I'd go so far as to grouping in Missouri and Montana and Indiana into the mix here. Now, I know this makes it seem like this map is a lot less probable than it actually is. I will say that it is very difficult to really discern between lower on the likely scale versus higher. So believe me when I say this, I don't think Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, Montana, South Carolina, or Alaska will be competitive. I think they are just going to be less safe. They're not going to be, safe Republican in the way that Trump is able to win them by 15 points or more. And I will say too, these states, many of them, started out based on the 2004 election a lot more pro-Republican than they ended up being in 2008. You can see here in Indiana, George Bush won the state by 21. 4 years later, Obama's winning the state. Missouri went to George Bush by 7 points. Just 4 years later, John McCain wins it by 0.13%. North and South Dakota, Bush plus 27, Bush plus 22. Montana, Bush plus 20.5. In 2008, Montana goes to McCain by 2, actually. North Dakota goes by 9. South Dakota goes by 8. West Virginia, you actually started to see an expansion there for Republicans. But again, my point still stands that overall, we saw nearly a universal shift in favor of the Democratic Party. And that required some of the states that, sure, ultimately ended up going to the GOP and, sure, were more solid for the GOP. But the reduction in support there displayed what the national shift was telling us. And that's exactly what this would do too. President Joe Biden likely maxes out at 319 electoral votes. I even think maybe this would move over and remain second into the lean red column, and that would be the extent of it. Nothing more, nothing less. Maybe I could be convinced that Colorado, which was already Biden plus 14, would become, Biden plus 15. I think that actually is a reasonable argument. But Virginia, probably anywhere around Biden plus 12, 13. New Mexico, anywhere around Biden plus 11, 12. Minnesota, somewhere around Biden plus 9. Same thing in New Hampshire. And so that's pretty much it. Biden would be at 319, Trump would be at 219. And it would be a very interesting electoral map, and one that certainly we're not expecting today. It's a complete, total opposite from what we see on the national numbers in this no toss-up Real Clear Politics polling map. But that's what I think is interesting about a scenario like this one. It would defy expectations, but also would play right into what we would expect if President Biden was to perform better in some of these battleground states. Now, of course, again, point of comparison. My map today, a map in a scenario like this one. I think this also goes to show just how unlikely a map like this one actually will end up being. Because this map, while the Democratic Party's dream of an election in 2024, I can guarantee you nearly fully will not be the outcome of this election unless something drastically changes in the next 5 months. Democrats are running out of time, and Biden's victory could very well be on the backs of core constituencies and core bases in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and Arizona, while losing Nevada, losing Wisconsin, losing Georgia, losing North Carolina. Biden still has pathways to victory, and right now I still believe he is the favorite in this presidential election. But we cannot ignore the fact that there could be a map like this one, which is why I always think it is interesting to explore hypotheticals like this. Biden at 319, Trump at 219. This would be the best performing map for President Biden in the 2024 electoral college vote. I don't know why I blanked there. Thank you guys again so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.